Welcome to Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Story Talks is produced by Narativ, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Story Talks. In this podcast, Julienne Ryan, who's with me right now, and myself, Jerome Deroy, discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. So there are more people who identify as disengaged at work than there are who say they feel engaged. So we come from Narativ, which is a company that focuses on engaging businesses and their audiences through the power of listening and storytelling, employing a 7-step method to do so. There are many people out there who work to increase engagement in a variety of ways, and we want to hear from them so that we can give you, our listeners, the benefit of their wisdom. And today we have such a person. Today's guest is a former active duty United States Marine with over 25 years of experience in coaching and leadership development. He's the CEO and founder of the Leadership Phalanx, where he combines his civilian and military experiences with his love of history to bring you what he calls the 11 shields of the Leadership Phalanx. These shields work together like the ancient Spartan formation to provide you a strong leadership foundation that values diversity and inclusion as fundamental to building strong, successful, and innovative teams. And I will add that I had the immense pleasure to be on his very own podcast, which we're going to be talking about. And it was just such a pleasure that we had to have him on the show. So welcome to the show, Earl Breon.
Yeah, no, thanks. I really appreciate it. Hi, nice to finally get to meet you and Jerome. Great to get to speak with you again. And thanks for the wonderful introduction.
You're so welcome. And just great to have you here. So maybe just to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself? I know I gave a little bit of an intro there, but I'm especially interested in how you ended up creating a podcast called the Responsible Leadership Podcast, and where did that kind of inspiration come from?
Yeah. So again, talk about narrative and storytelling, right? So it was a culmination of many years of events. So after I got out of the military, I joined the civilian federal service, and I expected to come in and see leadership everywhere, just like I saw in the military, and that just wasn't the case. And so I set out to do something about it. So I started developing my first training as part of that civilian federal job. And, that went over fairly well. And then they opened up a mentoring program, and I signed up for that as both a mentor and a mentee. And through the course of that, one of the folks I was mentoring, said something to the effect of, "Hey, you're pretty good at this. Have you ever thought about doing this kind of as an actual job instead of just an add-on?" And I'm like, "Well, no, I haven't." And so I got to looking into the whole process behind that, and a lot of stuff talked about platform building, and started talking about, hey, write a book or do this or do that. And one, John Lee Dumas, I stumbled on some of his stuff, and he talked about platform building through podcasting. And that really kind of got me intrigued because I love to talk. I'm from the South. I've never met a stranger in my life. I love to talk. And I'm like, hey, people actually have a platform I can go. It's very low barrier of entry, and I can reach, thousands of people across the globe that might want to listen to me talk. I can do that. So I started going through the concept of, or developing the concept, and I settled on the original name of the show was The Burden of Command. Because as a military person, I'd started hearing a lot of civilian leaders use that term, the burden of command, or command and control. And I started asking them this question. You're using these words. It was a very Princess Bride moment, you're using these words, but I don't think they mean what you think they mean. So why don't you tell me what you think they mean? And sure enough, there was some disconnect with how we use them with how they were being used in the civilian world. And so that was where I said, okay, I'm going to start a podcast where I ask as many people as I can that question: what does the burden of command mean to you? And so that went along fabulously for about 120 some episodes, somewhere in that neighborhood. And I was interviewing an SEO expert And doing the follow-up discussion after the podcast, he said, Earl, something was really bugging me. I didn't know if I was going to bring it up during the conversation or not. So what's that? He goes, well, I do SEO, and I got to tell you, he goes, I love your show. I love the concept, but is your viewership struggling a little bit? Yeah, how'd you know? He goes, because nobody goes on iTunes and searches for the words burden or command. I was like, okay, well, there's the sledgehammer between the eyes, right? Okay, you're right. And so we chatted for a little bit, and he gave me some, free advice, professional courtesy, and we settled on responsible leadership being very close to burden of command, but something that was a little bit more SEO friendly and kept the previous 130, 140 episodes I had at that time in the can, kept that as something I could keep going fluid and kind of a very easy brand transition. So that's how we got to the Responsible Leadership podcast. And it has been a marked success just by changing the name and very little else.
I have a question. When you said about your backstory, where you were looking in your job when you went into the civilian world, was there a particular model of one or two people in mind that you kept coming to mind when you thought these were leaders that I experienced in the past and this is what they represented to me? Were there?
Yeah, definitely. One of the people I talk about a lot, he was one of my sergeants in the Marines, Rusty Alberall. I love to give him a shout out whenever I can, because he had this unique ability, even in the military. A sergeant's not a super high rank, but in the Marine Corps, it's you got authority. That's somebody that you really respect and look up to. But he had this great ability of knowing when to be Sergeant Alberall and when to be Rusty Alberall, and never the two should cross, right? I mean, there was a definite delineation there, but he could do that. He could be your friend. He could be somebody you could talk to. He could be a confidant, but when he needed to be the person with some authority, he could do that, and he could do it in a fair and equitable manner. And that right there was the person that I think of a lot that influenced my thoughts on leadership. Was how can you balance having the authority of a position and having the leadership ability and build a relationship at the same time?
Thank you.
Yeah,
it's fascinating to me because I know that when you and I talked on your podcast, Responsible Leadership, and we were sort of defining that, what that means to me, and then we talked about it. It's fascinating to me to hear, for any person really, where things start, and that for you, it seems like it was a very kind of organic thing. You saw something that wasn't working in the civilian world that you re-entered after being in the military. And then you took what you had learned in the military and seen that was working well there and thought, well, why not apply those principles and see if it works? And then kind of trial and error. Oh yeah, that works. I mean, was it a bit like that? Was it a bit trial and error? Were there things that you sort of along the way thought, oh, that's really just for that world, doesn't translate to this world, or was it, or not? I'm curious about that. If there are things that just don't work, that work in a certain setting but don't work in other settings.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I say this kind of tongue in cheek when I get asked this question. I say, it's funny how in the civilian world they don't like to be yelled and screamed at like they do in the Marines, right? But even that, like that's also one of those myths of military leadership I like to debunk. Is that's not how we lead on a daily basis. That style, that very control, not even command and control, it's just control type of leadership works very well in, say, boot camp. That's a very specific purpose. There's not a lot of wiggle room. We have a very designed criteria, very short amount of time to get there. But it really was, getting into the civilian world, like even thinking that I was not being authoritarian because I had this, I was in a high authority leadership structure. I still came across very authoritarian, right? A lot of people would say things like, you're not in the Marines anymore. You need to calm down. I'm like, Okay, I'm very calm right now. Like I can show you what is, but I had to get past that, right? Because that was something that I was used to. And I have had to water that down quite a bit. But at the end of the day, what I found out was just like in the military, people want you to invest trust in them. They want you to build relationships with them. They want to know that they can trust you. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a bunch of universal truths across leadership, no matter what environment you're in. And that's kind of where the 11 shields, which are civilianized versions of the 11 leadership principles, that's where they kind of come in. Because while yes, some people completely thrive with somebody telling them what to do every single step of the day. Some people will just melt in that environment, and some people like a good mix. And it's finding out, getting to know those people, building those relationships, and understanding how to lead each person the way that they need to be led, not trying to apply a blanket approach to everybody.
And so is that the idea behind the 11 shields, is that you may use 5 of them and 6 of them maybe. How does that work? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, good question. And so the answer is kind of yes and. They all work together, right? I tell folks, like with these shields, the great thing about them is you can do any one of these things and you're going to see improvement. You do any 2 of these things, you're going to see improvement. But they're designed to work together, all 11. And that's why I use that Phalanx iconography, because, if you've ever seen the movie 300 or anything about the Spartans, and you see that Phalanx, the strength was all the shields being interlinked, right? And so with these shields, they're things like you're always on display, right? Just remember, everybody's always watching. Act how you say you believe, right? Don't tell people that you believe in a fair, equitable, diverse, inclusive workforce, and then go out and hire counter to that or make comments counter to that. Introspection and improvement, getting to know yourself and taking some action to become better, to grow. Kaizen is not just something for a widget, it's something for ourselves, right? Building relationships, right? And getting to know your people and using that information to look out for them, not use it against them, look out for them. And so those are just kind of the first 3 shields that I talk about. But yeah, you can use 1, 2, 3, 4 of these shields, but they really work the best when you employ all 11.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just going back to that idea of what it sounds to me like is that what you're offering and what you're building on is a very strong kind of structure that people can operate in. And I really feel like many times where leadership falls down is that you may have a great leader, charismatic, visionary, with a fantastic ability to enroll people into their ideas. But then when it comes to the implementation or even the minute things as hiring the right people, et cetera, that then gets delegated and as it should. But oftentimes it's in that delegating process that then things fall down, because that leader that's charismatic, visionary, et cetera, isn't there every step of the way, because they can't be. But there hasn't been anything put in place that's strong enough to really help people operate in an environment where they feel like they have ownership, they're empowered, all those things. Is that a fair representation of what it is that you're doing and kind of using those shields for? Because I to me, that's what I see as something that's often a pitfall of leadership. It's not about the individual that's a bad leader, but it's more about how the ripple effects.
Right. No, I think that's an extremely fair assessment. That's kind of how I've started kind of voicing my elevator pitch, if you will, right? Is a lot of leadership development programs, if they exist, start off at a high level, right? I look at, the Stephen Coveys, I look at the John Maxwells, I look at a lot of the greats, and, even folks, that aren't quite as well known. They have a lot of great content, but they're talking kind of at like the master's PhD level.
Mm.
And what we really know, according to some research that was done by, I believe it was Pew back in 2012, there's about a 10-year gap from the time someone is promoted into a leadership role until the time that they get their first formal leadership training. So what we see in a lot of leadership development programs is they'll go and they'll buy, 7 Habits or Strengths Finders or something like that, and they'll give it to their team, and they'll say, do this.
Right.
And then they'll walk away thinking that they can just naturally do those things. What these shields do is, as you said so well, they provide this solid foundation of skills that most folks are either A, lacking, or B, and I think B is probably a little bit more often, they have, but they're not aware that they have these skills, and they're not aware of how to pull those skills out of themselves and use them effectively. These shields going through them give you a nice baseline and give you that foundation. And then when you go pick up, Jerome's book, or you go pick up John Maxwell's books, and you say, oh, hey, I remember what Earl was talking about in the leadership Phalanx and these shields. And when you talk about the things like you just talked about, right, is being able to come up with a plan, but maybe not having the skill set to implement it. One of the shields, define success, empower team members, achieve results, is all about that. Define success, figure out who can lead that project, give them the power, the authority, the trust, the relationship investment to let them go execute it, and then assist them through the process so you achieve the results. Not a lot of leadership talks about stepping back and being a follower. You're either a leader or you're a follower. It's a revolving door. You got to know when to play what role.
Yeah. You just reminded me of one of my first experiences when I started out at Narativ, and I wasn't yet trained really in the framework, and I was kind of helping on the business side of things. We went to it was one of kind of a big corporation and media corporation, and we walked in and everybody had that book, The 7 Habits of Effective Leaders. So you just reminded me of that. And it was very similar what you just talked about, because I was struck by the idea that, people were kind of left to their own devices, and giving people the book was a nice, they even said this, that this would be a nice sort of leave behind. And read it in your own time, so there was no structure attached to it, and I can see how that often happens, and we sort of think, well, they're grown-ups, they can just read the book and then do everything that it says to do, but that's not quite how things work.
And Earl, there's a picture of somebody that came to mind, and when you're talking about military and how much one person can make a difference in a department or in a group. And this person that's coming to mind was not a big job person. He was a veteran who I hired in a department years ago, was in the accounting department. And he made such a sea change in how everybody was working together, because he came with this presence. He wasn't loud. He wasn't yelling at anybody. He was just doing his thing, but how he brought his timeliness and accountability and all these little subtle things. And suddenly we saw a whole sea chain happening of how folks were collaborating and really communicating. So it's always stayed with me, like how one person can really change. And it doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be, talking all the time.
Yeah. And I love that, because, that goes back to that first shield, you were always on display. And I think the reason why I gravitated around these when I was kind of putting my business together is because, well, they're true, right? They have their roots back 2,700 years. Like if you go through Sun Tzu's Art of War, you see these same things. Now we boiled them down from the whole big Art of War to these 11 principles, but they start, at least in the Marines, I can't speak to all the other branches, but this is first thing, day one, boot camp. We're going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about always being on display. Somebody's always watching. And, like you mentioned there, that is a big piece of that type of leadership style. Is it's not, bombastic. You don't come in and say, oh, look at what I'm doing. You just do it. Right. You show that type of leadership.
Right, and in that sense, that's what you mean by always being on display, is that whatever, even if you're in a corner doing something that nobody's really noticing, but yet will have an impact on how people work, and because we're all interrelated, right? That's what you mean by we're always being on display, as opposed to like we're doing a show of it.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like everything you're doing, right? I mean, I always talk about, just outside the four walls, right? So let's just say you are the best example of a leader you can possibly be while you're on the clock, right? And then you get in your car, you leave the parking lot, you drive down a block, somebody cuts you off, and all of a sudden you turn into a crazy, ranting, raving lunatic that's flipping people off.
Right.
And then you look and it's somebody who works for you, right? All that time you spent during the day trying to pretend that that's who you were just got obliterated in that moment because you forgot that you're always on display, right? And it happens anywhere and everywhere you are. If you say that you're a kind, generous person, and one of your employees or a person from your church or maybe somebody you're dating or whatever that you don't see, and you're in, say, a grocery store and you see somebody drop something and you don't offer, you don't bend over and pick it up and help them out, you're on display. People are always watching.
Yeah.
Even people who you don't interact with, you're setting an example always, full stop, always, for people around you. Right?
Yeah.
Kids are watching, everybody's watching.
Yeah. And including yourself, right? That's what
Right.
sort of came to my mind is are you operating in integrity or out of integrity, right? And that example you just gave, that's what that is, right? If you're, and we see this all the time, right, Jules? In terms of, organizations, because we talk a lot about embodying an organization's values, and how does that, because all these organizations have values that are either put on a wall or in a brochure somewhere on a website, and unfortunately many times they just stay there. And if you ask anybody that's working in that organization that's not part of the leadership, or maybe even sometimes the leadership themselves, they'll be hard pressed to tell you what those values, maybe they'll tell you what they are, but what they mean is a whole different story. Right. And so that's where the asking people to tell stories around those values, around being on display, what does that mean to you? To me, those are all ways to sort of start to bring something to life, so it doesn't feel so abstract, but also making people accountable is what I also heard from what you were saying, Earl. Is if I'm going to say I'm going to be a certain way, then I need to be held accountable to that as well. Especially when I'm in an organization, we're all accountable to one another for how we do things, and how we operate.
Do you have a story for us? Because you're from the good state of Tennessee. We are known for storytellers. They thrive. That's an epicenter. So I fully expect you to have a story about a leadership person, maybe someone you worked with who went from maybe a certain style and grew and developed because of your work. I mean, I don't put you on the spot, but I know you're trained to react in any situation.
There you go.
As a trained professional.
So because of my work, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Past and present. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I do. There's a gentleman that when we first started working together, kind of through that civilian program, he was ready to essentially quit, like ready to walk out the door. He wasn't happy where he was. Didn't like the leadership model that was in place in his division. And we started talking, and we started talking about this being the change, right? You need to be that change. You need to set that example. And we worked through. We did a lot of work, and we're still we still work to this day. He's since did I don't want to say a 180 because he was always stellar, but it was the work environment he was in that was kind of leading him to want to exit. But we talked about sticking it out, being the change, setting the example, moving up, getting in those positions of authority so you could be on display and show good leadership. And sure enough, just last year, he was promoted to a division chief and won a couple of recognition awards from various organizations for his leadership style. And the folks who are working for him now, talk about how great it is having a leader that gets it. And that's the reason I asked you to kind of clarify, because I'm hesitant to take credit for it, because this was stuff that was always in him, right? It was just helping him kind of get through that rough period, stick it out, and get that drive to move up in an organization, to make that difference. And so yeah, I helped, but it was a lot of what he already had inside of him.
Absolutely. And you're there to recognize and appreciate the gold that he had in them.
Yeah, that's the one thing I tell most coaching clients whenever we start. I said, there's going to come a point in our relationship where you're really going to hate me. So that's when you look back and you realize how much money you paid me to make you realize that you knew everything that I told you already.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we have that in common, because we often say that what we're doing with storytelling at Narativ, it's a bit like what a packaging company is doing for water. The water is there and it's available. We're just packaging it basically. And
Right.
for us, the stories we reflect very much the same way you do. It's these stories that we help people find and craft and tell. We're not making them up for them. We're not writing them for them. They're telling them themselves. They're finding it themselves. We're giving them a framework, much like you're giving people a framework to find their authentic way of leading and what their style is, and kind of getting them out of whatever difficult situation they are in. But that's so much, I mean, to me, that's part of leadership as well, is what are your own ability as a leader to find the right support, as opposed to, that person that worked with you, they found you, and thank goodness, but they had the wherewithal to sort of say, I need some help with something because this isn't working. And, or maybe someone else said, you should go see Earl, but whatever the case, they came to you, right? And they showed up for that. And I think that's another thing that I often, a misconception about leadership is that it's sort of the lone leader that just has this incredible ingrained, innate ability to do all these things and think up all these ideas, but it's not true at all. It's more about your ability to help others, and empower others, so that you can sort of just guide them a little bit.
And that's exactly what I love the work that you and Jules are doing over there, is because it's 100% spot on. I think people really, when people hear story, right, they gravitate to George R.R. Martin or Tolkien or those folks. They think this grand story, right? And we're telling each other stories constantly, right? That's part of this being on display. Everything I'm doing, I'm telling you a story about who I am, and you're telling yourself a story about who I am. And the people who are watching are telling themselves a story about who we are as we interact, right? And stories are everywhere, right? We're always telling and evolving our stories. And so that's why I love y'all's emphasis on the storytelling piece, because it's the natural way that humans interact with one another is through storytelling.
Yeah. And what you just said something that reminded me of something I wanted to ask you about. So I'll do it now. But this whole idea of I know that you do some work in the space of diversity and inclusion, and that's an important piece of this leadership kind of framework that you have. And I'm wondering, when you were just saying we've got stories about ourselves, about the people around us, we make up stories all the time. That recalls in my mind the idea of assumptions, that the minute somebody walks into the door, or in our case, on Zoom, whatever, we have an assumption about them. And then these assumptions, they get reinforced, they get dispelled, but sometimes they don't get addressed at all because nobody's talking about their assumptions. And that, I wonder what your take on that is, and what you see in the world that you operate in around assumption. Is that something that you kind of look at, and how do you address that?
Oh, that is the epicenter of all of it, is those assumptions, those stories we tell. We see somebody that fits a certain stereotype, right? How they're dressed. We're telling ourselves a story about how that person is going to interact with us, right? Before they even say anything, we already know what they're going to say. We already know how they're going to speak. We already know that this is what type of confrontation is going to be. Is it going to be friendly? Is it going to be, we know these things because we're telling ourselves this story. And the hardest thing for me to get people to do, but it's the most critical thing for people to do, is realize that there's a very good chance that that story is completely false, right?
Yes.
You don't know that person at all. And the story you're telling yourself is based off of data that you have of past interactions, whether it be in person, whatever the source is. But you have a responsibility in that interaction to not rely on that story, to not rely on that assumption. And especially when the person is telling you things that make that story false, to not sit back and say, well, I'm a better storyteller than you. I know what's going on. You're just pulling the wool over my eyes. Be able to understand that this person is who they're telling you that they are. They're telling you their story. You don't have to fill it in anymore, right? And we have these moments all through our lives, right? My partner that helped me found the leadership Phalanx, he tells a story all the time. He's an African American gentleman, and he tells a story about in his home, Anne Arundel County, of going to a Barnes and Noble, and he's like, I see this guy. He looks just like me. He goes, I'm like, oh yeah, my brother. I'm gonna go talk to him. He goes, and I ask him a question, and he turns around and he's got this thick Scottish accent, right? He's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. He's like, are you messing with me? And the guy's like, no. And again, thick Scottish accent. The guy's like, and he had one of these moments, right? He had built this whole story about this guy and how it was going to act. And this guy telling him, hey, I was born and raised in Scotland, blew his mind, right? And so that's a kind of a fun example of that. But, they're not always that fun and chipper, right?
Right. No, for sure. Yeah. That's great, though. I love how you I mean, all along, really, this interview, just make it very. I can picture what you're talking about. It's not just a kind of concept. There's a lot of concrete details there, and that's a great story. Speaking of stories, I wonder. I mean, I know you talked about, obviously, this is quite foundational to who you are, and your business, having been in the military and what you learned from that experience and witnessed. And also, you talked about the sergeant as well. That was so influential. But I wonder, we ask this question of every guest here on Story Talks around whether there's a particular moment, or it could be a relationship, whatever, an event that shaped who you are today. And it may have something to do with your business. It may not. But is there a story that comes to mind when I ask you that question, a moment that shaped who you are today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to go, I don't know, maybe a little bit different than some of your previous guests. I haven't listened to them all, but for me, that moment was probably when I was just a few months old. My mom and dad split. They both had their various issues. My dad wasn't ready to be a dad. My mom was ready to be a mom-ish, but wasn't ready to grow up. She was 16. This was the mid to late 70s. She was kind of in the hippie movement a little bit and doing drugs and things like that. So my grandfather and grandmother stepped in. And they provided me this great environment to grow up in, that got me away from all of the statistics, all the stories we tell people of broken marriage homes and drug problems and all that kind of good stuff. And so they took me in. My grandfather, primarily on my dad's side, he was a big player. So because of my mom kind of having some understanding of who she was and where she was in her life, and having the foresight to say, okay, yeah, I'm not ready for this. My grandmother and grandfather stepping in. I had this great parental father figure mainly, but also a mother figure in my grandmother that helped me grow up and helped me evade some of those stereotypes. and help me not go down some of those paths. Like, you look at the statistics of my life, I should not be doing anything that I'm doing right now. Right. I should probably be working, staying in my hometown, working minimum wage jobs, and maybe being in and out of the jail system. But he stepped in and he instilled some of those World War II, he was a World War II vet, some of those era qualities in me. But he was also a very kind, caring, thoughtful person of others, sometimes to his detriment. And that was the thing that he put on display all the time, was taking care of others. And I think that's the big thing that molded me through my life, was caring about other people, taking care of other people, and being that type of person that wasn't afraid to care for other people.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing that deeply personal story in terms of your background, and I appreciate you telling it with emotion.
Yeah.
Because it and not sort of I know that that's not who you are, but not shying away from it, right? I think a lot of people stop themselves the moment they think, oh, this is going to make me a little emotional, and the I'm here to tell you and our listeners that the effect to me is always the same. It's the opposite. It's like I lean in because it feels true, it feels real that this really happened. And the other thing I'll say, so thank you for that, first of all. And the other thing I'll say is just, we were just talking about assumptions, right? And, I now have, this is my second interaction with you because we or third interaction actually, I went on your show, then we had a conversation about coming on this show, and now here we are. And, in my mind, it's like, oh yeah, Earl is that leadership guy who was in the military and took a lot of stuff from that and put it into the civilian world. And what a great conversation we had around all these concepts. Let's have another one. And here's another layer now that I had no idea about, but it completely changes the way I see you. And it sort of dimensionalizes you. And there's a thing that we always come back to in storytelling is, to kind of help people find their story is this idea of remembering your heritage. And grandparents feature prominently in that part of our process. And so I just find it fascinating that that's where you went, and that for you, that's truly where sort of those origins are, that you're very connected to that. And I think, a lot of people aren't really connected to their heritage and get a lot out of trying to reconnect to it. So I appreciate all of that. And then my final thing is that, my father passed away just a couple of weeks ago. And that, to me, as you were talking about your grandfather, I was thinking about my own father, because that's who that person was to me. Just the structure that he created, the safety and all of those things that, are hard to put into words, but it's something that you feel and that allows you to kind of move forward. And it's funny because at the very beginning of our conversation, this word family kept coming into my mind, just because of everything we've talked about. Like it does feel like all these structures, whether it's in an organization, the military, or an actual family, when some of that gets torn apart or modified in some way that doesn't feel right, it's really detrimental. I mean, it really kind of, you lose that foundation. And so I was just reminded from my own sake of that foundation that my parents created and that your parents created for you. So I invite everyone who's listening to think about that. Think about your own, the people around. And for some people, it's not parents, it's not grandparents, it's other people, teachers,
Right.
perhaps. But I think it's really important to connect to those moments and those people, even if they aren't with us anymore, to just kind of remind ourselves of like, yeah, that's where my foundation comes from. That's where I can always go back when there's a challenge or a difficulty and I'm not sure of my footing. I know that for me, that's where I go, because it's like that's where the footing was set. I know I can't fall.
I always say the right story is going to show up at the right time. And this is one of those examples of how it dovetails with your own experience, Jerome, recently, and Earl, what you just shared as a very gift of sharing. So thank you.
Yeah.
So it's just timing. It's serendipity in a lot of ways, like what comes through these podcasts too. Thank you.
Yes.
No, it's, and I just, yes, and thank you for that. And I just want to, share, because I know we don't have time to get deep into it here, but I would just say, kind of building on what Jerome said and kind of what Jules was talking about there. If you haven't heard of this term yet, I highly encourage everyone to look into moral injuries. The concept of moral injuries, and it explains why a lot of this type of stuff happens the way it does and the impacts it can have on us. So
that's great. We could go on for the rest of the day here because it's just so great, and the stories are great, and the concepts are great. And thank you so much for bringing all of that to life for us, and for sharing about your own personal experiences and background. I think that's really helpful for everyone. Is there anything, Earl, that you would want? I mean, you just talked about the concept of moral injury, and for people, encouraging people to look into that. Is there anything else that you would want people to know about you and your organization? Perhaps a website that people can go to, or resources that they might be able to find through you?
Yes. So the website is just leadershipphalanx.com. I know that's kind of an old word. Not a lot of people are familiar with it. So it's just leadership, PHALANX, Phalanx. And most of the stuff is there. There's a link to the Responsible Leadership podcast. There's a few blog entries. Again, I'm not a big writer. I'm a talker. That's why I've got, 200 and some odd podcast episodes and 8 blog entries or something. But,
I don't feel so bad now.
But I think that's the big thing, right? And depending on who's listening and who's hearing this, I hope you've taken something great away from it. But definitely, if you're in a position to influence the leadership development in your organization, whether you actually reach out to me and ask me to come in or not, I've got the 11 shields on the site with a quick breakdown of each one. Take a look at those, implement as many as you can. And if you want to do a deeper dive, reach out to me through the website. There's a contact form, and we can tailor a program to fit your needs. If you need a couple hour seminar, if you need an all day event, if you want a big workshop, we can tailor these things to however it can fit in your need to help your team understand these concepts and help everybody be a better, more responsible leader.
Love that word, responsibility.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And I highly, highly recommend the Responsible Leadership podcast and everything that Leadership Phalanx has to offer. Earl is you're a wonderful person and wonderful leader yourself. And really, I look forward to continuing and building on our relationship moving forward. And absolutely, if anyone who's listening has any questions for Earl, we'll be happy to put you in touch with Earl, and so please don't hesitate. Jules, I want to thank you for being my wonderful co-host, and I don't know if there's anything you want to add as a kind of a parting. I'm
good. I have 50 more things I'd love to talk about, but I have to quiet down.
We'll have 50
when we
more
log
episodes.
off. I'll
Yes,
pin
right.
Earl down. Request.
Right. There might be a part 2 on this one. All right. Well, great. Thank you so much, and thanks to our listeners for listening. And as always, please visit our website at narativ.com. That's narativ.com for information on how you can find, craft, and present the stories that'll engage your audiences like nothing else has before. And we are always ready to listen to our listeners, and whatever challenges you may have, don't hesitate to bring them to us. And again, this is Story Talks, and you can find this everywhere you find podcasts. And please spread the word and leave a review on your favorite platform. That always helps. Word of mouth is quite the thing. There's nothing like it. And again, thanks Earl Breon for being with us. Thanks, Jules, for co-hosting as usual.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
We will all see you next time. Thank you.
Narativ Story Talks. For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narativ.com.